Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And on behalf of our entire board and staff, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of the middle of a busy day to join us for a conversation with Dr. Jason Gulley. A couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please double check and make sure that you are muted and you remain muted throughout the duration of our time together today. Exception is obviously during the question and answer portion at the end. There's two ways you can ask Jason a question. One is use the raise your hand feature, and I'll ask you to unmute. You can talk directly to Jason. The second option is to drop your question in the chat, and I can ask it for you. That option is really helpful in case you have a question pop up in the middle of the presentation. You want to make sure you don't forget it. So that's the boring stuff. Now we're going to talk about the really fun things. I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Jason Gulley. He is a professor of geology at USF. He's a photographer, a writer, a National Geographic explorer, a lover of manatees, so many things. So Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much for the introduction, Michelle. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share screens again. And when I enter slideshow mode, I actually won't be able to see what's going on here. So if you need something, hopefully we're seeing my Lightroom library again. And let's see, I'm gonna go ahead and hit play. All right, so as Michelle mentioned, I'm a geology professor at the University of South Florida, and I have spent probably the better part of the last 15 to 20 years having been fortunate enough to travel around the world to investigate how humans are impacting the planet. So scientists are increasingly more specialized. I specialize in caves. So I've probably spent a year of my life working in the Everest region where this image was taken at high altitude, trying to understand how glacier caves are impacting how quickly glaciers are melting as climate is warming in that area. And I've also worked across the Arctic, trying to understand exactly how warming is affecting how quick the Greenland ice sheet is melting, a couple of other smaller islands kind of around the Arctic. And again, one of the things that happens is as temperatures are rising is more and more and more of the Greenland ice sheet is melting. And we got these massive lakes that form on the ice sheet. If you look very closely in the center of the frame there, you'll see one of my graduate students, very, very tiny in the frame, to give you an idea of just how big some of these lakes can be. All right, those lakes will disappear overnight through cave systems, and that water will make its way to the base of the ice sheet. It lubricates the contact between the ice and the underlying landscape and allows the water to let the glacier flow 300 to 400% faster in summer when the ice sheet's melting than in winter when it's not melting. And what we're trying to understand is exactly how caves like this one are going to be impacting the ice sheet as more and more of them form and lubricate areas of the ice sheet that haven't been lubricated before. Okay, I also do quite a lot of work in underwater caves. Again, you can tell I'm a huge cave nerd. Also tend to like a lot of stuff. I like any type of projects that involve lots of technical equipment. It's one of the things that draws me to underwater photography, lots of gadgets that I can use. And this is a photograph of some friends of mine diving in a layer of fresh water in the coastal aquifer in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. And underneath of what you see just below them is a microbial cloud that lives at the interface of fresh and salt water. So everything underneath of them in that image is hundreds of feet of salt water, and everything above them is about 100 feet of fresh water. So one of the things that I love about caves is it gives us this unique ability to observe things inside aquifers that we aren't able to observe in most other parts of the planet. Like a lot of people, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I found that I was kind of trapped at home. Fortunately, being trapped in Florida, there are worse places to be trapped. All of my international research was canceled. And I sat at home on the couch. I was pretty depressed. And all of a sudden, I wasn't going 150 miles an hour anymore. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of sit and think about what I'd done with my career so far and what I wanted to do into the future. And I realized that as scientists, we know more now than at any other point in history how humans have impacted our planet, and in particular, how people in Florida are impacting the environment that we live in. But fewer people seem to understand or care about it than when I went to university in the 1990s. So what I decided I wanted to do was use this background that I had in photography and journalism that I kind of put on a shelf when I became a scientist, and use it as a way of sharing with the rest of the world a lot of the things that I've been seeing, as a scientist and also as an explorer. So I became first acquainted with springs in Florida as a kid. I grew up in the southwest corner of Ohio, and my grandmother would bring me down to some of the roadside attractions that she liked when she was a kid. Like, we saw the mermaids at Weeki Wachee before it was a state park. We went to ride on the glass bottom boats in Silver Springs. And then later, as an adult in college, I came down and learned how to cave dive. So Florida has more than 1,000 known freshwater springs. It's the most dense collection of freshwater springs in the world, and they collectively discharge billions of gallons of fresh water to the surface every day. Okay, so the thing that I love about springs and caves in particular is that they give us access to this hidden world beneath the surface that we wouldn't know if it was there unless we went. So for example, this is a massive cathedral-like chamber, very, very deep cave. But the entrance is in a swamp. Like, you go trudging through a swamp and then you look at the entrance. It doesn't really look like very much, but then you drop through this skylight and you're in this amazing underground space. Springs lead to miles of underground cave systems, just these total hidden universes. This is a photograph inside the Devil's Cave system at Ginny Springs. There's several miles of mapped cave there, and people are finding more every year. The cave system that feeds Wakulla Springs now has over 40 miles of integrated conduits that have been mapped in it. Okay, caves also, in Florida give us windows into these crazy natural phenomenon. So this is something that only happens, that we can witness happen for a couple of days a year. So whenever there's a flood on the Swanee River, all of that tannic water starts building up very, very high to high levels inside the river. And eventually the water level in the river is higher than in the aquifer, and all of that tannic water starts pushing back down into the aquifer. And for a very brief period of time, those forces, that cold water from the surface that's pushing back into the spring, are almost exactly balanced out by the water, the groundwater that's pushing its way out. And we can get in there and witness this kaleidoscope of colors. You have to time those dives pretty carefully, because if the river level comes up too fast, it's like flushing a toilet and all that water goes into the spring. So fortunately, we pay a lot of attention to what we're doing and make sure that we're doing that at safe times. So all of the water that we see that comes out of springs in Florida originates as rain, and that water percolates through the sand, it percolates through the limestone. Super spongy limestone in Florida screens out most of the organic carbon and all the other particles that make water look super mucky in other environments, and it comes out of the ground as these crystal clear springs. An average residence time is on the order of decades. Now I say an average because some of that water spends a long time coming into springs. Other water transits very, very quickly, going through fractures and conduits. Okay, so those springs are vital resources for sustaining surface water streams in Florida. Almost all of the water flowing through the Swanee River Basin originates in springs. So this is a photograph of the Devil's Ear and the Devil's Eye Spring on the lower Santa Fe River. These springs and the handful of other springs that are on Ginny Springs property collectively discharge 40% of all the water flowing through the lower Santa Fe River. So if we lose the water in those springs, we lose the rivers that they support as well. Okay, springs are not only important for the water that they contribute to surface environments, but they're cornerstones of rural economies. So individual springs can draw tens of millions of dollars to rural economies that have very few other economic resources available. So, for example, Florida is one of the top locations in the world for people to come and learn how to go cave diving. People come from all over the place. It was one of the things that blew my mind in the 90s. You would see people from like Russia, the Baltic states, all over the place, learning how to dive around lots of people that are just showing up and having a picnic on the weekend. I will say that cave diving is often kind of looked at as like a fringe activity, maybe a little less now because of perceived dangers. But one of the things about cave diving, it's a little bit like flying an airplane. There's a whole lot going on, but if you have quality instruction and you pay attention to your equipment maintenance, it's actually a very safe activity. So, for me, I had been doing a lot of work trying to understand scientifically how caves in Florida were forming. And I was writing up all of those results for scientific audiences. And I realized that, nobody reads scientific papers. So, during the COVID pandemic, because I lived in Florida, I had a lot of extra time to focus on photographing some of the things that I loved about springs and some of the things that I found really inspiring about springs, and then some of the things that worry me about them as well. So This is Troy Spring, also in the Swanee River Basin. It's one of the larger springs in the state. It is a first magnitude spring. And a lot of times when I show this image, people are like, wow, that's so beautiful. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the problems that our springs are facing is that they don't necessarily look all that ugly. Like, this is still super clear water. I'm sitting on the bottom of a spring and we can still see people swimming on the surface. But when I first started diving down here in the 1990s, you could sit in this very same location and look out through crystal clear water, and you could count the individual leaves on trees overhanging the spring basin. And now this is about as good as it gets. It's pea green. It's pretty, but it's not supposed to be pea green. Okay, other things that we've seen as cave divers is a lot of the caves that we're diving in have tremendous amounts of flow. You're literally clawing your way in against the force of the flow to get into the caves. And one of the things that we've noticed, periodically over time, is that the flow, we don't have to fight as hard as we used to get into some of these caves, and the flow is reduced. And it's not just a bunch of us sitting around talking about how things used to be better 20 years ago. And one of the things that, I always remember is that when I first started diving 20 years ago, or cave diving, more than 20, almost 25 years ago now, people like Wes Skiles would talk about how much better things were 25 years before I started, right? So, as more and more people come along, those baselines are constantly shifting. So it's important to have like actual, pieces of data that we can point to and actual observations that we can make, rather than just anecdotal stories. And this photograph is of the bathhouse at White Sulphur Springs in the Upper Swanee River. So this was one of Florida's original tourist attractions. It was very, very important for Native Americans who lived in the area, and it was later discovered by early Floridians who turned this sulfur spring into a bathhouse. People would come from all over the country to soak in sulfur waters because they thought that they had healing properties. Well, starting in about the 1970s, the water feeding this spring dried up. So it wasn't the first, but it was one of the first early spring casualties. So now White Sulphur Springs rarely flows at all anymore. Okay, this is another spring which was once the cornerstone of a very important, economically very important recreational area in the city of Tampa. This is Sulphur Springs. In the 1920s, Sulphur Springs was like the place to go to like see and be seen. There was a boulevard, there were high dives, there were water slides. People would go and swim around in this place, and until about the 1980s, when the water started becoming increasingly more and more polluted as development spread out across Tampa Bay. So eventually this spring became too polluted that the city had to close it to swimming altogether. And then in the early 2000s, they built right next to it a concrete swimming pool, which is fed with treated city water. So it's this, we've lost this natural resource that we've then had to pay to replace. Okay, so in Silver Springs, still very, very pretty. One of the original underwater film sets in the state of Florida. People came from all over the place to see what was living inside the clear water in the springs, and also to film movies. So if we look kind of down in the bottom there, there's a couple of statues that are left over from the television show I Spy. And again, that clear water that attracted everybody is still there, but a lot of the old movie sets and a lot of the exposed surfaces are now increasingly being covered by algae. So there's teams of volunteer divers that go into the spring every couple of weeks now and scrape all the algae off by hand so that people can look at the underwater movie sets instead of just big hulking mats of algae. This is a photograph of Oscar Collins, Captain Oscar Collins. He has been driving glass bottom boats for over 50 years at Silver Springs. And this is him getting his boat ready for a morning tour. And I asked him, I was like, Oscar, like, what have you seen at Silver Springs over the 50 plus years that you've been working? And he, he got quiet for a little bit. And he's like, there's a lot less grass than there used to be, a lot less fish, and a lot more algae. Not super quantitative, but it's stories like that that I think are really important for understanding how people who have lived in these environments are experiencing those changes. So, historically, a lot of the springs look like some real gems that we have today. Itchitucknee is still a gorgeous spring. This is a photo of Rainbow River. There's eelgrass everywhere. Just, eelgrass is the foundation of a healthy spring ecosystem in the same way that trees are the foundation of a healthy forest ecosystem. So if we have that eelgrass, we have that healthy aquatic vegetation, then we have a healthy ecosystem. When we lose it, it's like losing the trees in a forest. Okay, and that's exactly what's been happening in spring runs across the state. Again, very important to remember that not all springs, but many springs are being impacted by increasing amounts of nutrient pollution from agriculture and sewage that have been linked to explosions of algae that are choking out the eelgrass. Okay, so this is a photograph of one of the last strands of eelgrass in the spring run at Peacock Springs State Park. Okay, this is another photograph from Troy Springs where you've got what looks like troll hair algae that's covering all the surfaces. This is stuff that wasn't there 20 or 30 years ago. And a lot of the nutrients are coming from fertilizers. Okay, so these are fertilizers that are largely produced in the state. Agriculture is a very important business in the state of Florida. I don't know how many people know that fertilizer production also very important to the Florida state economy. Florida is one of the #1 producers of phosphate in the world. And a lot of that rock is mined primarily kind of down around Bartow and to a lesser extent up by White Sulphur Springs. There used to be a lot of mines. This is actually the Swift Creek mine complex up by White Sulphur Springs. And again, all that rock is mined and then turned into fertilizer, which is used in the state and other places. That's inorganic fertilizer. There's also a lot of organic fertilizer, which is produced from a booming dairy industry. So one of the things that surprised me when I first started working on stories about springs was just exactly how much manure dairy cattle produce. 200 dairy cattle produce the equivalent amount of sewage as a city of 5,000 to 10,000 people. Okay, and there has been an explosion of dairy cattle ranching. That's not really ranching if it's confined. There's been an explosion in the dairy cattle industry that was linked with the migration of parts of the industry from around the Everglades when a lot of the farms were bought out to reduce pollution going to the Everglades. The number of cattle in the Springs areas in Florida exploded. Okay, one of the other things that we're seeing in Florida, again, tremendously important for the state's economy, is an increase in the amount of agriculture. So in and around the Swanee River Basin, the Florida Department of Agriculture is anticipating a 37% increase in the amount of agriculture that we're going to have, irrigated agriculture that we're going to have in that area. That's about 48,000 acres of new agricultural lands that are going to be cleared and planted by 2045. Okay, and again, I know that there's always a lot of concern about agriculture, but there's also this other reality, which is that if we don't have farms, houses. I think Wes Skiles used to famously say that houses are like the last crop that gets planted on a farm. So as farms, as farms kind of either expand in some areas or wither and die in other areas, they're often produced or replaced by subdivisions. Okay, so one of the things that farms, farms and subdivisions are very important for the economy, but they're also causing a number of problems for springs. Okay, these are some very similar problems I realized that we're facing Florida's manatees. Okay, so I'm going to confess I was not a fan of manatees for a very long time. I didn't understand what the fuss was. I was really into cave diving and diving very deep and exploring caves, like high adrenaline things. The idea of snorkeling around with a slow moving animal, that spends half the day sleeping and half the day eating just didn't really seem very appealing to me. But when I was working on a story about springs, I realized that it was going to be very important for me to photograph manatees because they use springs as winter habitat. And so I was like, all right, I'm gonna take one for the team. I'm gonna go try to take a picture of a manatee. Hopefully it looks different than all the other pictures of manatees that I've seen, where it's like a fat, chubby animal smiling with a sunburst in the background and maybe a palm tree that you can see through the water. And then I can go back to, the hard work on springs. But, so I hopped in the water for the first day and I was immediately blown away. I saw manatees in a totally different light. I had thought that they were just kind of like fat and lazy and didn't do a whole lot. But what I saw and what really struck me was just how graceful manatees were. They are incredibly beautiful swimmers. They, I saw manatees playing, I saw manatees doing just super graceful, inspiring things. I was like, I have just not seen photographs of manatees doing these types of things. So, I got addicted and, canceled all my plans for the rest of the week and decided that I was going to try to photograph manatees. Of course, I also had to photograph manatees doing, adorable stuff as well. And some of my grad students have like to laugh and they're like, "Oh, Dr. Gulley, you just like to photograph manatees because they're cute." And it's true. They are adorable. And one of the reasons I like to photograph them. Okay, so I didn't actually know very much about manatees because I wasn't planning on photographing them. So as soon as I got interested in them as a subject, I'm a scientist. I dug into the scientific literature. I've probably read most of the scientific literature on manatees, definitely all the books and a huge portion of the published literature. Manatees are air-breathing mammals. They need the surface to breathe, every 3 to 5 minutes or 20 minutes when they're sleeping. They spend most of their lives in super murky water, so they can see, but that's not really how they navigate through the environment that they spend most of their lives in. We get used to seeing them in the clear water of springs in Florida, but most of the time they're in super murky water. So their body is covered in this network of super fine sensitive hairs that allow them to sense pressure migrations. Manatees have incredible memories and mental maps of the world around them that allow them to navigate really without being able to see very much at all. They have voracious appetites. Manatees can weigh up to 3,500 pounds and be 13 feet long, and they need to eat 4 to 9% of their body weight in vegetation every day. That means that manatee herds need vast areas of healthy sea or eelgrass to be able to support them. Manatees are totally dependent on their mothers. As mammals, they're born live. They nurse from their mothers and totally dependent on their mothers for the first 2 years of their lives. Some manatees hang on a little bit longer than others and, take a little bit longer to get away from their mom. But in general, they're still adorable. And sometimes manatees attack, right? They just kind of come out of the murky water and bang, there you go. But it's the most adorable attack ever. Manatees share a common ancestor with the elephant. So this common ancestor walked off the west coast of Africa and into a shallow, warm ocean to eat all the seagrass that was abundant in the area at that time. So like elephants, they have fingernails, and this little guy is using them to scratch a little itch on his face. So the Florida manatee is a subspecies of the West Indian manatee. This is a photograph of a West Indian manatee down by the coast of Belize. Now, Florida manatees are unique. They're the northernmost manatee species, which means that they experience winter. Okay, so manatees, it's not to say that manatees in Mexico and Belize don't experience winter. It's just that it turns out that winter is pretty warm down there. So they don't actually have to go to springs to survive winter. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But this is a photograph. It's a little bit of behind the scenes that shows some of what we're doing to make some of these images happen. Now, again, there are a lot of regulations governing how you can interact with or photograph manatees in different countries and states and so on and so forth. But one of the things that we try to do is become part of the environment. I do a lot of the photo work by myself. And the only way that you can successfully make images of wildlife is to become part of the environment, right? And you do that by being very, very quiet and not moving very much. And some of the technologies that I use for exploring underwater caves are also super useful for photographing wildlife. So we use closed circuit rebreathers that allow us to spend lots of time underwater. They don't make any bubbles, so they don't scare wildlife. And again, not allowed to use those everywhere, but we do use those where possible. And again, one of the other things that I like about this image is it just shows how big manatees are in relation to people. So in Florida, manatees look fat, but they have surprisingly little body fat. They can't survive in water colder than about 68 degrees Fahrenheit for very long, right? So they have to find warmer water or they'll die. Okay, so historically, manatees would make their way into freshwater springs, the majority of which have temperatures of between 73-ish degrees down here in the Tampa Bay area, all the way up to Wakulla, where the water temperatures are a little closer to 69 degrees. Okay, so warm enough for manatees and lots of other animals that don't like to be particularly cold to survive winter. Okay, and you'll get these mass aggregations of manatees that are hanging out in springs. And then later, beginning in the 50s and 60s, we started developing a lot of electrical generation power plants. And many of these are coal-fired. and they suck in large amounts of seawater, use it to cool the equipment, and it gets returned back to discharge canals as heat, right? So now the majority of manatees in the state of Florida have become dependent on these coal-fired power plants or power plant warm water outflows. So more manatees are moving to power plants instead of springs. This has created a big problem for the future because as we start retiring all of these kind of fossil fuel power generating technologies, we have to figure out a way to get manatees to learn how to go to other places where they can find warm water to survive. Why is that a problem? Well, manatees learn how to survive and where to go to survive winter from their mothers. So manatees typically go back to the same place year after year after year. So the trick then is, how do you tell manatees that that power plant that they've relied on for generations isn't going to be there in the future? Okay, manatees aren't really picky about where they find warm water. You know, they can find it in, discharge in, canals that tap shallow aquifers that have warm water just in people's backyards. Okay. So this is what happens to manatees if they get caught in cold water. This is a manatee named Citrine. She suffered from life-threatening cold stress. She was brought back to Zoo Tampa and survived. Now, if you look closely, you can see that there are white sores and scars that cover like almost all of her exposed skin. She was not really expected to survive, but like many other manatees pulled through. They are incredibly resilient animals and survive things that you would think were completely and totally unsurvivable. Okay, so, but when we talk about cold stress, this is what it is. It causes a lot of the blood flow to pool inside of the manatee and allows sores and other infections to take over their skins. Their skin basically starts to fall off. It's horrific. So right after I started photographing manatees, the die-off began over in Indian River Lagoon. And at first it didn't seem like anything super unusual, but then hundreds of manatees started dying in Indian River Lagoon. So I spent, a couple weeks in March running around Indian River Lagoon, trying to, get an understanding of what was happening over there. And, there were, it wasn't like there were dead manatees everywhere, but, there were quite a few manatees. So over the last 2 years, over 2,000 manatees across the state have died. The epicenter is over in Indian River Lagoon. And it turns out that the primary problem is similar to what's happening in springs, which is nutrient pollution linked to development and economic activity has flooded the lagoon with excess nutrients that caused algae blooms that choked out all of the seagrass that manatees are eating. So here is a manatee's lower jawbone on the floor. It's covered in the same algae that was helping wipe out a lot of the seagrasses that manatees were eating. So, and again, in Indian River Lagoon, a lot of that a lot of that excess nutrient is linked to fertilizer and sewage from developments kind of running off from those areas and into the lagoons and fueling those algae blooms. So, and again, with no food, right, the manatees starved to death. So that was, that was like a really, super low point in this story is, really depressing, not only for me, but for, I'm sure for people who had been studying manatees for their entire career. Okay, so what I wanted to do, a lot of times people will ask me like, well, what can we do, right? So what I wanted to know is like, well, what are people doing about this? And I wanted to be able to share it, with the rest of the world. So, some of the first people I met were actually out in Indian River Lagoon. It was a Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission biologists. And the work that they're doing for the current die-off is incredibly important. But the first thing I want to point out is that even though 2,000 manatees have died over the last 2 years, which is awful, it's a tragedy, right? If we just go back 50, 60 years, there probably weren't 2,000 manatees in the state of Florida to die. Right. So we have seen a tremendous rebound in manatee populations, largely because of the result of organizations like the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then local communities and, and community organizations who've worked very, very hard to bring manatees back from the brink of extinction. Okay, so now one of the reasons that we were able to do that is because biologists, like the ones that we see in this image, go out and they examine all of the corpses of manatees that die. Okay, and what they do is they do these field exams, and it tells us a lot about how manatees die. So if you want to figure out how to prevent manatees from dying in the first place, you have to understand how they're dying. So we know that manatees were dying as a result of a massive a starvation event because of the work that they did, but we also know a lot of the other things or problems that manatees face because of the hard work that they're out there doing every day. So these manatees are covered in blue marks that are outlining the propeller scars of all the different boat strikes that these manatees have had in their entire life. Now, these are used as part of a statewide identification database. People can go and look up these scar patterns. They're a little bit like a little bit like fingerprints. They're unique and they allow these manatees to be identified. But we can also learn a little bit about how some of the challenges that manatees face in their environment. So 97% of manatees are hit by a boat at least once in their life, right? 25% of manatees have been hit by a boat at least 10 times. Okay, some manatees have been hit over 40 times by boats. So, because manatees spend most of their life hidden beneath the surface, I think, it's really easy to forget or ignore some of those challenges. I often wonder what would happen if we had a terrestrial animal like a bunny rabbit or something that was, 97% of them were maimed by some other recreational activity, what we would do. So other things, I live very, very close to Zoo Tampa. Zoo Tampa has the second largest critical care facility in the state of Florida. The largest is over at SeaWorld. Their team has done an amazing job over the last several decades at developing a lot of the medical intervention that we need to keep injured manatees alive. So, they have veterinarians on staff that are caring for injured or sick manatees, orphaned and infant manatees. And, their goal is always to rehabilitate them and release them back into the wild. So if you go to Zoo Tampa, you can see them, all the manatees there, except for one who's too injured to be released, are, undergoing care and treatment and eventually going to be going back into the wild. Okay, so they and all of the other critical care centers across the state were inundated by manatees over the last couple of years because of the UME, but they all come together to make sure that they always have the capacity available to accept any type of manatee that needs to come in for treatment. This is Flapjack. Flapjack was a manatee that came in emaciated. This wasn't from Indian River Lagoon. He's a West Coast manatee. Mostly West Coast manatees are winding up at Zoo Tampa, but if you look very closely, you can see some of his ribs are poking out, and they're feeding him this kind of medicine and then also some food through his nose. Okay, one of the things that happened with this UME, this unusual mortality event, is that there was a large number of manatee infant orphans that survived. So previous UMEs were caused largely by red tide or cold stress, right? And both of those are going to preferentially kill smaller, weaker animals like babies. In this instance, because manatees were starving to death, the mothers were actually able to continue nursing their young until the mother died. And then often the babies were found and were able to be brought to rehabilitation centers where they'll spend probably about 2 years of their lives waiting until they can grow large enough so they can be released back into the wild and be successful. Okay, so baby manatees require crazy amounts of care. They're bottle fed every couple of hours around the clock, right? So hurricanes, middle of the night, doesn't matter. Somebody is in there bottle feeding orphan manatees. Okay, and again, eventually this is the goal for release. This is one of the first releases that I was able to photograph. I've since been to a number of releases. It's always great, especially after spending a lot of time photographing tragedy, to see a manatee who's recovered go back into the wild. This is a very famous manatee named Chessie. At the time, I didn't even know that manatees could be famous. But this is a manatee who's very famous for his long distance excursion. So again, people think of manatees as being these kind of lazy sedentary animals, but Chessie swam as far north as the Chesapeake Bay and then got trapped by cold water and had to be rescued and brought back to Florida and has since been rescued again, but makes these very, very long distance excursions. Manatees go that far north and as far west as Texas, but then every year, every winter, they have to come back to those warm water locations that they learned from their mothers to survive winter. Okay, so Another really inspiring story is happening right now and has been happening over the last couple of years in Crystal River. So Crystal River has a lot of the same problems that Indian River Lagoon did in micro scale. So, Crystal River, very intensely developed area around, very intensely developed around an estuary. Okay. So, and a lot of fertilizer and sewage and everything else flooded Indian River Lagoon with excess nutrients that fueled algae blooms that made the water really dark and choked out all the seagrasses that manatees eat in the area. And this is a photograph of an area that's still not doing very good, and a manatee with his head kind of buried in that algae muck. Okay, so but Indian River is Crystal River is one of the few places where I've been in Florida where I can say that it's better now than it was 5 years ago. So, and it's largely because of the work of a group called Save Crystal River and Sea and Shoreline in partnership with state and with the state agencies and state funding. So Save Crystal River recognized that they had a massive environmental problem that was happening in their backyard. Their water, in Crystal River was murky and nasty, and none of the fish were there anymore, and nobody really liked what Crystal River had turned into. So they said, well, what do we need to do to fix it? So they got together with some aquatic restoration biologists and came up with a plan to fix it. And it wasn't something that worked the first time. It wasn't something that even worked the second time. Through a systematic series of trial and errors, they figured out the steps that they needed to restore at large scale underwater aquatic environments. And it turns out that one of the most important steps is dredging up all of the organic muck that has accumulated on the bottom of Crystal River. This is a photograph of a diver soaking up or dredging up all of the nutrient-rich pollution, that muck that's accumulated at the bottom of the lagoon. It's important for two reasons. The first is that if you replant seagrass in the muck, it's really easy to pull out. So the roots come out with the seagrass. The other thing is anytime the wind blows, it resuspends all of that muck, and all of the pollution, all those nutrients just trigger more algae blooms. So you have to get rid of it. After you get rid of it, then you can replant the seagrass in the sandy substrate that's at the bottom. That's what the bottom used to be before all that muck started accumulating. Okay, so what they were able to do then, the first time they did, they replanted it and the manatees came in and they ate all of it. And they're like, well, that didn't work. So they're like, well, we actually have to protect the grasses from the manatees until the root systems can become firmly established. So they planted all of these grasses underneath of metal cages. So there's hundreds and hundreds of metal cages all over the place. The root systems are protected and can grow deep into the sand for the better part of a year. And then the cages are removed, and the manatees then have access to eat the grass. Okay, so one of the things that I've seen happen over the last couple of years is visibility is the best that it's ever been. Well, the best that it's been since restoration started. Visibility is improving in a number of places, and there are over 100 acres of aquatic grasses that are available now that are supporting year-round populations of manatees and fish. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody. Okay, so one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to do, and one of the things that I like to remind everybody, is that it's really easy to get focused on all the bad things that are happening out there. And there's a lot of really bad stuff that's happening environmentally, but it's also really important to remember how far that we've come. And, one of the examples that I give when I'm teaching in some of my hydrogeology classes at the university is, like when I was a kid, we used to have acid rain, we learned about acid rain, and acid rain isn't really a huge problem anymore, right? Rivers used to catch on fire before the EPA was created. Like, when's the last time you heard about a river catching on fire? So, we still have problems and we still have a lot of progress to make, but it's really important, I think, that we pause and think about how far that we've come, because otherwise it's really easy just to get fixated on how bad stuff is and not remember that we still have some really beautiful places in the state that exist, and that hopefully we can protect for future generations. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing screens and give it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Jason. Getting a lot of comments in the chat about how much people are loving your photos, and I just wanted to reach through the screen and boop all those little manatee snoots. So thank you so much for sharing those fantastic photos with us. I want to be respectful of the fact that you are not a a specialist in fertilizers or a manatee biologist. In fact, one of FWC's manatee biologists, Michelle Pasowitz, is with us. She dropped a resource in the chat for folks who are interested in a study showing the impact of watercraft on manatees. So if that's something you're interested in, check out the chat. So I'm going to ask some questions, Jason, that have come in. And if you feel like that is outside your area of expertise, feel free to say pass, and we can work on getting folks' getting answers and getting back to you. So Julie is wondering if Florida is seeing any increase in fertilizer production since it might be harder to buy from Russia now. I don't know if that's anything you've been tracking or aware of.
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, I mean, it would make sense. I don't know if that's true, but you know, Russia is one of the other main producers of the phosphorus containing component of fertilizer. So
yeah. So Julie also was asking about if that's brown algae that's on the skin of the manatees. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
So there's algae that grows on the skin of manatees. It's super interesting. We'll see it on Florida manatees, but I've done a lot of work in the Amazon with Amazonian manatees. The water's a lot darker there, so you don't get as much algae growing on the manatees' skins. But manatees' skins have these crazy microfloras on them. You know, there's algae and all kinds of stuff that grows on them. There's little nematode worms that actually live inside, well, on top of the skin of manatees as well. So. But yeah, so not necessarily a bad thing.
Great. Also, Julie is asking some great questions. She's asking, since manatees have little body fat, like why are they so round?
It's because they have enormous digestive systems. So their hindgut fermenters, you know, you can think about them as like enormous cattle. And they have to have, you know, the food that they're eating isn't super nutrient dense, so they have to eat a lot of it. So like if you, I forget, I'm sure Michelle could remind us what the length of a manatee intestine is, but it's crazy long. And again, yeah, so very big around because of enormous digestive systems.
Great. So we have a question asking from Marty about Crystal River, wondering how long manatees stay in Crystal River at the power plant, and what are your thoughts on snorkeling with them, with the groups that are going there and doing, you know, swim with manatee trips?
Yeah, so the you know, there's a small year-round population of manatees that hang out in Crystal River. Anecdotally, you know, it seems like some moms and calves are hanging out throughout the year because it's kind of a nice, quiet environment for them. You know, that's been good for some of the manatee tours because they are able to show people manatees year-round. I think the main source of warm water in Crystal River these days is the springs. I don't think the power plant's online anymore, but it's not. Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah, so that power plant's been offline for a while now. Anyway, somebody else will chime in. But anyway, so like you know, manatees didn't actually have to go very far to find warm water. You know, there's a power plant right next to a whole bunch of warm water springs. So as far as the manatee tours, yeah, I have mixed feelings. I think that in general, they're a net positive, though. So I think, you know, some of the tours are maybe, I think some of the tours are more respectful of manatees than others, but in general, I think that they provide an important service for bringing people to experience manatees in the natural environment. So one of the things that I've experienced, having spent a lot of time around there, is that I haven't seen anybody get out of the water and be like, I don't understand what the fuss about manatees are, is like, we should just get rid of them. Like everybody comes up like totally changed, and they're, you know, like me. I mean, it wasn't like I was saying that we should get rid of manatees or whatever. I was like, I just don't understand what the fuss is, right? And then you get in the water and you're like, oh, I get it now. You know, and it always reminds me, it's one of the reasons that I got motivated to spend a lot more time and effort on photography and writing. You know, Jacques Cousteau really famously said that, you know, people only protect what they care about, and they only care about what they know. right? So these tours, even though I've seen some interrupt manatees, that manatee might be sleeping or whatever, and someone will kick their fin or kick their foot. And most of the tours aren't wearing fins, and it'll disturb a manatee. It'll just move someplace else, right? And then the guides usually keep them from following them. That's kind of I think that like as long as the level of harassment is low, the trade-off and the benefits are much better, right? It's like it's one location where people are able to go and interact with manatees. I think most people are doing a really good job. I know that a lot of the really responsible tour operators would actually like to see more enforcement against some of the less responsible tour operators, because it's really hard if you've got one tour operator that lets you like, hey, just ride the manatee, and you've got all these other, tour operators that are like, no, you can't do that. So yeah, like I said, I think in general, it's a net positive. Even though sometimes there's bad stuff that happens, I don't think it's stuff that's actually causing any lasting harm to manatees. There's actually been a lot of research that's been done on, not a lot, but there's been some research that's been done on how tours impact like the long-term health of manatees. And it doesn't really seem like they're affecting the survivability of manatees in winter, even though they might be irritating some manatees.
Perfect. We have a question from Tony asking about if you've ever seen a manatee inside a cave system while diving. And I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about your recent trip for the Mexico cenote trip.
Yeah, so I've never seen a manatee inside of a cave, but I know that there's one place in Mexico where the only way for manatees to get to a particular site is through an underwater cave system. So manatees are definitely, there's no other way in or out of this particular estuary other than through an underwater cave. And so it seems, yeah, so maybe someday I'll get to share a cave with a manatee. That would be an amazing photograph for sure. So.
We have a question from Marty about cave diving. If you have any recommendations for what would be a first good cave dive for a beginner. And I know you're teaching classes on this, so this is great.
Yeah, so I think so I guess it would depend on whether or not you already had cave training. So unlike regular scuba diving, regular scuba diving requires a lot of training, but cave diving requires a lot of advanced training, even beyond like the level of an instructor. Much like flying an airplane, and driving a car have a lot in common because you're using two different things to go from point A to point B, but the environment's really different. It's the same thing with cave diving. So a lot of different equipment, a lot of different techniques, but after you have all of those, I'm sure that you and your instructor would be able to come up with some really good places to figure out for where might be a good place to go and try cave diving. Now, if you just want a taste of what cave diving is like in a very sanitized environment, Ginny Springs has what's called the ballroom. It is a site that's available for open water divers to go into. There's a gate that prevents access to any of the deeper parts of the cave. I'm not going to say that you couldn't kill yourself in there, but you would have to work really, really hard to kill yourself in this environment if you were a trained scuba diver. So it's where a lot of people go to look around with a light and see if they think it's for them. And it's, for the most part, I find that people have one of two reactions. They either go in and they're like, nope, not for me, or they're like, wow, this is amazing. It's very bimodal. I don't have a lot of people that go into a cave and they're like, well, I don't know, it's okay, I guess.
Not an ambivalent kind of response. How long have you been cave diving?
I started cave diving in 1999.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So we're all caught up on questions. So I just wanted to do a quick plug. Jason is now part of our Springs Plate Committee, who's going to be helping us decide which projects get funded. If you want to help support Springs work, you can buy a Springs Plate at your local tax collector's office or on our website, wildlifeflorida.org. You also, if you're as motivated by his photos as I am to love those manatees, we have a number of ways to get involved in supporting manatees. We are fundraising to buy the lettuce for the supplemental feeding trial happening in the Indian River Lagoon through the rest of the month. We're also doing habitat restoration work. One of our partners is Sea and Shoreline, who Jason mentioned did the Crystal River work. They're experts, in addition to Aquatech, who we work with, doing at 9 sites habitat restoration in the Indian River Lagoon. So if you want any more information about that or want to know how you can plug in and support it, you can get that information also on our website. Just looking, just more and more kudos for you, Jason. Lots of people love the photos. For folks who didn't notice, we did record the presentation and we'll be sharing it with the same way that you found out today via our social and our e-blast. So if you want to be sure to have this for yourself and just pause and stare adoringly at the manatees, or share it with somebody you know who you think would appreciate this, we'll be sharing that out soon. So I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm going to give folks a few more seconds to ask any questions. And Jason, if there's anything else you wanted to say as we wrap up.
Yeah, if you didn't see the story that we did for National Geographic in the January issue of the magazine, I wasn't able to show any of those photos. They're still under embargo. So if you haven't seen it, go see it. It's awesome. Also, if you're interested in other ways that people in the state are using conservation photography and film as a way of doing something incredible, if you haven't seen it already, go see Carlton Ward's Path of the Panther. It's still in films. It is an incredible story about how, Carlton, in conjunction with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, worked together to preserve habitat for the Florida panther and create the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So it's a great way of showing how, conservation and state agencies, can all work together to achieve some really important conservation wins.
Yeah, I want to do another plug for Path of the Panther. Beautiful film. We did get a couple questions coming in. Folks are excited to ask you some last minute questions. Jason, do you have any sense, being out in the water, how intelligent manatees are?
Well, so, they share a common ancestor with the elephant. One of the things I will say is that most of the research that's been done on manatees, most not all, has been conservation specific. So there's been a lot less research that's been done on behavior. And most of what we know about intelligence is really based on 2 manatees that live at Mote Marine Lab. The manatees have brains that are shaped a lot more like grazers. So we think that manatees have incredible memories and spatial awareness. I say this, I'm not a manatee researcher, so I'm parroting manatee researchers. They don't have like the super like wavy crenulated brains that dolphins have. It's like dolphins and manatees are both marine mammals. They share the same environment. Dolphins have to use sonar, which requires crazy amounts of brain power. Manatees don't really use sonar, but they do chirp and communicate with each other a little bit. So I think, I guess that would be like a big question, like how do you define intelligence, right? They're super smart. They're very curious. One of the things that, I've experienced as a wildlife photographer is that pretty much all species exist across the behavioral spectrum. You'll have, some that are super curious, but then you'll have some that are super standoffish. And if you just become part of the environment, you get to experience that entire spectrum. But I think one of the things that always amazes me is like when I have a manatee that swims by, you can just see them looking at you, and they'll stare at you in the eye, and you can tell that there's something going on in there.
I'm super jealous of you right now. Great. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone. Oh, wait, we got one more. Julie got one under the buzzer. How long do manatees live in the wild?
So manatees live for several decades in the wild. And we know that in captivity, they can make it to about 65.
Great.
Hopefully Michelle
this has been
correct me if I say anything really wrong, but I'm pretty confident in all the manatee answers so far.
Well, so again, check out Jason's work. You can see it on been featured in New York Times. I know that you had a spring story there not about a year ago now, right?
Yeah.
And National Geographic. If you have any questions that pop up that we didn't get a chance to answer, feel free to email me. You can find my contact information on our website as well, and I can pass them along to Jason or Michelle or anyone else who can get them answered for you. And we hope to see you on. Oh, Michelle said that you're correct. 30 to 40 years in the wild. There you go.
Right. I get a gold star.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to talking soon.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right. Bye.